The house had been too quiet for 3 years. That was the first thing I noticed after my wife, Margaret, passed. Not the emptiness of the bed, not the absence of her voice calling me down for coffee, but the quiet, a deep, settled quiet that pressed against the walls and filled every room the way water fills a glass. I was 64 years old, retired from 31 years of teaching high school history, and I had nowhere to be and nothing that needed doing. I sat in the kitchen most mornings with my second cup of coffee going cold on the counter and watched the birds at the feeder Margaret had hung outside the window the summer before she got sick. I kept it filled. It seemed important to keep it filled. My son, Derek, called every Sunday. Prompt, almost mechanical, always around 11 in the morning, always about 15 minutes, always ending with him saying he'd try to come by soon. He lived 40 minutes away in Clarksville with his wife, Renee, and their 2 kids. I saw them maybe 5 or 6 times a year, holidays, a birthday here and there. I told myself that was normal. Grown children have their own lives. I had told my own students that for decades that the measure of good parenting was raising someone who didn't need you anymore. I believed it, mostly. On the days I didn't believe it, I went out to the garage and worked on the old furniture pieces I refinished as a hobby, and the smell of wood stain and the focus required kept the loneliness from getting too loud. My daughter, Pam, was different. She lived out in Portland and called whenever she felt like it, which wasn't often. But when she did call, she stayed on the phone for an hour and asked real questions. She asked what I was reading. She asked whether I'd been sleeping. She sent me books in the mail with little sticky notes on the covers that said things like, "Thought you'd love this," or "Chapter 4 made me think of you." I loved her the way you love someone who doesn't require anything from you in order to keep showing up. Derek was not like that. Derek had always kept score. I didn't understand that about him until much later, not until everything happened, and I had time to sit with it and trace it back through the years. But looking back, I could see it clearly. When I paid for Pam's semester abroad in college, Derek brought it up for 10 years afterward, in various forms. When Margaret and I redid the kitchen the year before she died, Derek made a comment at Thanksgiving about how it must be nice to have money to spend on granite countertops. Small things, sharpened things. I had brushed them off as stress, as the pressure of his mortgage and his job and his 2 kids in private school. I made excuses for him the way parents do. The estate was the thing that changed it. I found out what I was worth, what the house and the retirement accounts and Margaret's life insurance added up to when I met with my attorney, a plain-spoken woman named Carol Hutchins, to update my will about 8 months after Margaret's funeral. The number surprised even me. The house alone had appreciated beyond anything I'd imagined when we bought it in 1989. Altogether, I was sitting on an estate worth somewhere close to $900,000, with the expectation it would cross $1 million if the market held. I divided it evenly between Derek and Pam in my updated will, as Margaret and I had always planned, and I went home and didn't think about it again. I should have thought about it more. The headaches started in January. I assumed it was the cold, or the blood pressure medication my doctor had adjusted in December, or simply the accumulated weight of aging. I was 64. And I had been lonely for 3 years, and I had not been sleeping well. Any one of those things could produce a persistent headache. I mentioned it at my regular appointment in February, and my doctor, a careful man named Dr. Okafor, who had been treating me for 11 years, ran blood work and told me my iron was low and my B12 was borderline. He adjusted my supplements and told me to come back in 6 weeks. But the headaches didn't ease. They got worse through March. I started feeling nauseated in the mornings, a low rolling nausea that wasn't quite bad enough to call sick, but was bad enough to ruin breakfast. I lost 7 pounds between February and April, without trying to. I felt tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, a deep, grinding exhaustion that didn't lift after a full night of sleep. I went back to Dr. Okafor in April, and he ran more tests and ordered a CT scan and referred me to a gastroenterologist. Everything came back inconclusive. The scan was clean. The gastroenterologist found nothing structural. My doctor told me, with visible frustration, that sometimes these things were idiopathic, meaning the cause was unclear and we would continue to monitor. In April, Derek had started coming by more often. This was the thing I noticed but did not question, because I had wanted it for so long. He came by on a Tuesday evening in the middle of April with a container of soup Renee had made, chicken and wild rice, my favorite since childhood. He sat at the kitchen table with me while I ate and asked questions about how I was feeling, with a focused attentiveness he had not shown me since he was a teenager and needed something from me. I was so grateful for it that I felt ashamed of the gratitude. I told him about the symptoms, the tests, the inconclusive results. He shook his head and said I needed to take better care of myself. He said he was going to come by more. He said he was worried about me living alone. He came back the following week, and the week after that. He brought food each time, casseroles, soups, twice a baked chicken, always from Renee. Always things he said she had specifically made because she knew I wasn't eating well. He started helping around the house, too. Fixed the loose step on the back porch that I'd been meaning to get to for months. Replaced the filter in the furnace. I remember standing in the kitchen, watching him work on something under the sink, and thinking that I had been wrong about him, that this was who he really was, that people came back to themselves eventually if you were patient enough. I got sicker. By the end of May, I was down 14 pounds. The nausea had become a constant companion. I had developed a tremor in my left hand that came and went and frightened me more than anything else had. Dr. Okafor referred me to a neurologist. The neurologist ordered more tests. More things came back inconclusive or borderline or within normal range, but on the low end. I had a follow-up scheduled for the 3rd week of June, and I was beginning to allow myself the specific dread of thinking I might have something serious, something with a name and a prognosis and a timeline. I was 64 years old, and I was living alone, and I was frightened in a way I hadn't been since Margaret's diagnosis. My neighbor, Walt Greer, had lived next door for 22 years. He was 71, a widower himself, a retired electrician who kept his lawn with military precision and whose porch light was always on. Walt and I had the kind of friendship built from proximity and mutual respect. We talked across the fence, watched each other's houses, waved from driveways. After Margaret died, he had started showing up at my door, occasionally with an excuse to borrow something or return something, and I understood that he was checking on me without making it into a thing, which was exactly the kind of friendship I needed and was too proud to ask for. It was Walt who changed everything. On a Thursday afternoon, in the 1st week of June, I was sitting on the front porch in the early evening when Walt walked over from next door, without any pretense of borrowing anything. He sat down in the other porch chair and was quiet for a moment in the way he was when something was on his mind. I waited. Walt wasn't a man who needed prompting. He said he didn't know how to bring this up and he was going to ask me to hear him out before I reacted. I told him to go ahead. He said that 3 times over the past month, he had watched Derek come into my house while I wasn't home. Not when I was in the garage, when my car was not in the driveway, when I was clearly not there. He had a key. Walt understood that. But each time, Walt had watched Derek go in and come out within 10 or 15 minutes, carrying nothing visible but spending enough time inside to do something deliberate. The 3rd time, Walt had written down the date and time because something about the pattern had started to trouble him. He said he didn't know what it meant, and it was probably nothing. He said he was sorry if he was out of line. I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about the food Derek had been bringing. I thought about the nausea that had started 2 months after his visits began. I thought about 14 pounds and a tremor in my left hand and a string of inconclusive test results. I thought about the estate worth nearly $1 million. I thanked Walt. I told him he was not out of line. I went inside, and I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, and I let myself think the thought I had not been willing to think. The next morning I called Carol Hutchins, my attorney. I told her what Walt had told me. I told her about my symptoms and the timeline. I told her I needed to know what to do. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, that I needed to do a few things before I did anything else. She said I should not eat or consume anything that had come from Derek or that had been in my home when I was not there, starting immediately. She said I should not change my behavior toward Derek in any visible way. And she said she had a contact, an investigator named Frank DeLuca, former law enforcement, completely discreet, who she wanted me to speak with as soon as possible. I met Frank DeLuca 2 days later at Carol's office. He was a compact, quiet man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and a yellow legal pad he wrote on in small, precise letters. He asked me to walk him through everything from the beginning, the symptoms, the timeline, the food, Derek's change in behavior, Walt's observations. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Had I noticed any unusual tastes or smells in the food Derek brought? Had anything seemed off about my regular medications, bottles moved, amounts that seemed different? Had Derek ever been alone in my kitchen or bathroom for any period of time? I didn't have answers to most of it. I told him I had been too grateful for the attention to look closely at anything. Frank nodded and wrote something on his pad. He said the first step was documentation and the second step was evidence. He arranged for a discreet medical consultation, a toxicologist at a hospital 2 counties over who Carol worked with occasionally and who could run a comprehensive panel without going through my regular physician. Frank drove me himself. They drew blood and collected other samples, and the toxicologist, a direct woman named Dr. Vasquez, who asked questions with no visible emotion and took careful notes, told me results would take 7 to 10 days. Those 10 days were the strangest of my life. I had to continue being myself. I called Derek on Sunday at 11 and talked for 15 minutes and said nothing. I puttered in the garage. I fed the birds. I let Walt know what was happening and asked him to continue documenting anything he observed, which he agreed to without hesitation and with a quiet, steady anger I found steadying myself. I threw away everything in my refrigerator and my pantry that I could not account for and replaced it with groceries I bought myself and kept in a small cooler in my bedroom closet, which felt paranoid and necessary in equal measure. I stopped using the protein powder that had been sitting on my counter for 2 months, a brand I had never bought, which I somehow had never questioned, because Derek had mentioned once that he thought I should be getting more protein. On the 8th day, Dr. Vasquez called Frank. Frank called Carol. Carol called me and asked me to come in. I sat across the desk from Carol in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, and she told me what the panel had found. There was a compound in my system, a heavy metal, present at a level that was not acutely dangerous but was chronically toxic with sustained exposure. Not enough to cause a sudden emergency. Enough, accumulated over months, to make a person progressively weaker, sicker, more confused, more dependent. Enough, if it continued, to eventually produce outcomes that a general practitioner might attribute to any number of other causes in a 64-year-old man with existing blood pressure issues. Dr. Vasquez had been clear. The exposure was not accidental and was not environmental. It was ingested, regularly, over an extended period. I remember that Carol kept talking after that, explaining the next steps, but her voice became something I heard from a distance while I sat and absorbed what it meant. My son had been poisoning me, not in a moment of rage, not impulsively, deliberately, carefully, over months. He had been coming into my home when I wasn't there to do it. He had been sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, watching me eat his wife's soup, asking me how I was feeling. I had been so grateful. The grief of it was different from any grief I had known. It wasn't the grief of loss, it was the grief of replacement. Of having something you believed to be real taken out from under the real thing and replaced with something terrible. I had thought I was getting my son back. I had been being killed slowly instead. Frank and Carol gave me time and then walked me through what came next. Frank would expand his investigation to build a documented, legally sound record before anything was brought to law enforcement. He would work with the digital forensics contact he trusted to examine what could be examined. The toxicologist's findings were being formally documented. Walt would provide a written account of his observations. Carol was coordinating with a prosecutor she knew in the district attorney's office, a methodical man named Arthur Haynes, who had handled cases like this before, and who understood the importance of building a case that did not give defense attorneys room to maneuver. The hardest instruction they gave me was also the most important. I needed to continue as normally as possible. I needed to take Derek's Sunday calls. I could not confront him, warn him, or change my behavior in any way that might cause him to destroy evidence or alter his actions before they could be documented. I was to let Frank handle the timeline. I told them I understood. I went home and fed the birds and did not sleep. Over the next 3 weeks, Frank documented what he needed to document. He worked quietly and thoroughly and reported back to Carol, who reported back to me in measured summaries designed to give me what I needed without more detail than I could manage. What emerged was not a complicated picture. It was, in its way, a terribly simple one. Derek and Renee had been in financial trouble, serious trouble, the kind that had been building for years behind the surface of the life they presented. Private school tuition, an over-leveraged house in a neighborhood they couldn't quite afford, debt that had compounded while their income stayed flat. They had, according to what Frank was able to piece together, calculated the situation and arrived at a conclusion. The estate would solve everything. The estate would more than solve everything. And an aging father living alone, declining in health, with no witnesses, was a manageable problem. Renee's involvement was established. She had ordered the compound online through an account created for the purpose, delivered to a post office box Derek had opened 3 towns over. The account had been opened 4 months before the first Sunday delivery of food. They had planned it carefully and patiently. If there was something to be said about them, it was that they were not impulsive people. On a Tuesday morning in early July, Arthur Haynes moved. Law enforcement executed a search warrant at Derek's home and at the post office box. They found what they needed to find. Derek was taken into custody that morning. Renee was taken separately an hour later. I learned about it not from a phone call from Derek, but from Carol, who called me at 8 in the morning and told me it was done. I sat down on the kitchen floor when she told me. Not because my legs gave out. I chose it, deliberately, like a man who needs to be close to something solid. I sat on the linoleum and leaned against the cabinet and let myself feel it, all of it. The relief and the grief and the rage that I hadn't let myself feel while I had to stay controlled. And underneath all of it, something I hadn't expected, a terrible, bottomless sadness for the version of Derek I had believed in. The one who had come back to me. The one who was worried and attentive and fixing the back porch step. That person had never existed. I mourned him anyway. Pam flew in from Portland on a Thursday. I picked her up from the airport, and she hugged me in the arrivals hall for a long time without saying anything, and when she pulled back, her eyes were red, and she said, "Dad, why didn't you call me sooner?" I told her that I hadn't wanted to tell her until there was something certain to tell. She said that was the most me thing she had ever heard, and she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. We drove home and she made dinner, real dinner, from scratch. From groceries, she had me watch her unpack, and we sat at the kitchen table together and talked for 4 hours. She stayed for 2 weeks. She slept in the guest room that had been empty since Margaret died, and I heard her moving around in the mornings and smelled her coffee, and it made the house feel different. Not the way it had felt with Margaret, not that, not ever that again, but different from the quiet. Full in a way that I had forgotten houses could be. Dr. Okafor, once I brought him fully into what had happened, was shaken in a way that a man of his composure rarely showed. He told me that given the symptoms I had presented, the progression I had been experiencing was entirely consistent with the exposure, and that without intervention, the trajectory would have continued worsening. He worked with Dr. Vasquez on a treatment plan to clear the remaining compound from my system and address the deficiencies it had caused. My appetite came back slowly through July. The tremor in my left hand began to ease. I gained back 4 pounds in August and 8 more by the end of September. I started sleeping again. The legal process moved forward with the thoroughness that Arthur Haynes had promised. Both Derek and Renee were charged. The evidence was, by every account, overwhelming the account history, the deliveries, the compound found in their home, the forensic documentation of Derek's visits to my house, on days it stood empty, the toxicology report. Carol told me early on that this was not a case likely to go to trial. It was a case likely to result in a plea agreement. She was right. In October, both Derek and Renee entered guilty pleas to charges that carried mandatory prison sentences. At sentencing, Arthur Haynes presented the full scope of what they had done not as an impulsive act, but as a sustained, calculated attempt on my life for financial gain, carried out over months with premeditation and care. The judge's sentence reflected that understanding. I was asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I wrote it out by hand, 3 times, before I arrived at something I could read without my voice breaking. I talked about Margaret. I talked about what it meant to raise a child, the specific faith of it, the investment of everything you had and hoped and believed into another person. I talked about what it felt like to have that faith weaponized. I talked about being made to feel loved in the process of being killed. I kept it short. I read it to the court in a steady voice, and then I sat back down and looked straight ahead and felt Pam's hand close over mine. In the weeks after sentencing, I found that people I had not expected came forward in ways I had not expected. Walt, obviously Walt, who had been so carefully and consistently decent throughout all of it, who had noticed and spoken up at a moment when speaking up required courage, who had sat with me on the porch more evenings than I could count through those months, when I could not explain to anyone why I needed the company. I had a conversation with Walt one evening in late October, when the air had just turned, and the leaves on the maple at the edge of my yard were going gold, and I tried to tell him what his noticing had meant. He cut me off before I got very far. He said that's what neighbors were for, and he wasn't going to sit there and be thanked for it. I told him I was going to thank him anyway. He said fine, but he wasn't going to enjoy it. There was also a woman named Ruth, whom I met through Carol Hutchins. Ruth was Carol's older sister, recently widowed herself, a former librarian with a dry sense of humor and an opinion about everything that she shared without apology. Carol had mentioned, carefully and without any pressure, that Ruth had been going through something of her own hard stretch and might enjoy meeting someone who understood what hard stretches felt like. I agreed to a coffee that I expected to feel like an obligation, and that lasted 3.5 hours. Ruth had read more books than anyone I had ever met, including my most well-read students from 31 years of teaching, and she argued about the ones she loved with the same passion she argued about the ones she hated, which I found deeply refreshing in a way I hadn't anticipated. I drove home from that coffee thinking about what it meant to find someone interesting. Not as a replacement for anything, nothing replaces anything. I had learned that with Margaret, but as a door that had been closed and turned out not to be locked. I called Ruth a week later. She picked up on the second ring and said she had been wondering when I was going to call. I told her I hadn't wanted to seem eager. She said, at our age, seeming eager was a sign of good judgment. We laughed. It was the first time I had laughed like that in a very long time. Pam called me every few days through the fall. She asked real questions, the way she always had. One evening in November, she asked me how I was, not how I was doing, but how I was, and I sat with the question for a moment and gave her a real answer. I told her I was sad about things that deserved to be sad about, and I was grateful for things that deserved gratitude, and somewhere in between those two things I seemed to be finding something that felt like forward motion. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was glad. She sounded like she meant it. I updated my will in November with Carol's guidance. It was a different document than the one I had made after Margaret died. Not dramatically different on the surface, Pam remained the primary beneficiary, which she would have been regardless of everything, but different in the careful thought I had given to each decision. Different in what I understood now about what estates meant to people and what money could do to the stories people told themselves. I went through the process without grief and without anger. It was a practical matter that needed doing clearly. I went back to my garage in November. There was an old roll-top desk I had bought at an estate sale 2 summers ago that I had been meaning to get to, and I got to it. The wood was good under the neglect cherry, solid and patient. I worked on it through the cold months, and the smell of the stripper and the stain and the wax filled the space the way it always had. And I put on the radio, and outside through the small garage window the bird feeder was covered in juncos and chickadees, and the work required my full attention, which was exactly what I needed it to require. Some evenings, Ruth came by and sat in the kitchen while I finished up in the garage, and I would come in to find her reading at the table with her reading glasses on, a cup of tea in front of her, the kitchen light warm against the dark outside. She always had something to say about what she was reading. I always had something to say back. We ate dinner together most Fridays. She was stubborn and funny, and did not require me to perform any version of myself I was not actually feeling, which was a quality I had not known how much I valued until I had it. I am 65 now. I take my medications correctly, refilled from the pharmacy myself, kept where I keep them. I eat well. I sleep most nights. My left hand is steady. I have 17 pounds back. Dr. Okafor told me at my last appointment that my blood work was the best it had been in 3 years, which is a sentence I will not take lightly again. On a Sunday morning in December, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold the way it always does. Some habits outlast everything, and I was watching the birds at the feeder, and the light was coming in at an angle through the window, and it occurred to me that I had been sitting in this exact spot, watching these same birds, feeling this particular light, since the year Margaret hung that feeder, 22 years of Sunday mornings. She had picked a good window for it. I thought about what Walt had risked in saying something when something was easier not to say. I thought about Pam's hand over mine in that courtroom. I thought about Ruth arguing about a novel over dinner on Friday with the intensity of someone for whom books were not entertainment but evidence. Evidence that people were more than their worst impulses, that lives could be examined and understood, that it was possible to survive damage and still have something worth saying. I thought about Dr. Okafor's careful face when I had finally told him the whole truth of it, and the way he had been silent for a long moment before he said that what I had survived was not a small thing. No, it was not a small thing. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup and put on my coat and went out the back door and across the yard to the garage. The roll-top desk was nearly done. One more session with the wax, and it would be ready. I had someone in mind who might want it. There was a young teacher at the high school where I used to work, a first-year history teacher named Marcus, who had come to the school's retirement reception for me 7 years ago and shaken my hand with both hands and told me that history teachers had the most important job in the press, building. I had been meaning to give him something for years. A desk that had been through something and come out the other side seemed like the right thing. I opened the garage door, and the cold air came in, and the smell of wood and winter was clean and exact, and the work was in front of me, and I put on the radio, and I started.